So Habakkuk is one of the minor prophets. We had been doing Isaiah for so many weeks, maybe months. Then I thought it is a good idea to move to prophets like Habakkuk, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and probably Daniel later, because they all come from a particular period, the period after the 8th century, actually the 7th century. Habakkuk comes from the 7th century. And what is the exact timing of Habakkuk? Nobody knows. But there is a clue in verse 6 of first chapter. In chapter 1:6, in answer to Habakkuk's question, God says, "Behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans." Chaldeans simply means Babylonians, "that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own." So, this is a time when God says, "I am raising the Babylonians to attack Judah." So, that actually means that this is a time when the Babylonian threat was looming. How close we can say that? How many years before this? We are not sure. But we know that Babylon attacked Assyria, and Assyria, that which was the major threat during Isaiah's time, during his ministry in the days of Ahaz and Hezekiah, they were defeated or they were conquered by Babylonians in 612 as Nineveh fell. But the book of Habakkuk probably has to be dated a little earlier, when Babylonians were becoming a prominent power. So usually it's dated around 620 BC. That is still 8 years before. That is about means it is not the exact date. It's around 620 BC. That is 8 years before Assyria was defeated by the Babylonians. That way, he is probably the contemporary of Jeremiah, Prophet Ezekiel, Zephaniah, and possibly Daniel as well. Now, that helps us to understand the prophecy a little bit, because Babylon was emerging as a superpower and a threat to the other nations. And this is very unique. The book of Habakkuk is very unique in many ways. Number one, first of all, we don't have any biographical details of Habakkuk. There is no, like Isaiah, nothing autobiographical or any biographical details or any historical engagements, talking to kings or doing that or historical background, nothing like that. The main difference is, or main uniqueness is, it is not oracles. We have prophetic speeches. Thus says the Lord. This is what the Lord showed me. And things like that. Basically, oracles addressed to the other people, the people of Judah or Israel, or even nations. That is what we saw in the other prophets that we studied. The address is to the people. But the book of Habakkuk is very different. The book of Habakkuk is not dealing with oracles, prophetic speeches addressed to people, but it is basically a dialogue with God. That is, the whole 3 chapters of the 3 chapters means first and second actually. The third is a song. The first and second chapters is a 2 streams of dialogue with God. Why, God, you are doing this way? And God gives him an answer. Then a second question he raises, and God gives him an answer. So it is a dialogue between God and the prophet. And probably a third uniqueness I can think of is this is a prophetic book which questions the justice of God. That is God right? And the particular issue here is God right in using a foreign nation to punish his people? So God is planning to punish. See, for example, in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Amos, the book of Micah, in the book of Hosea, we saw that God is judging his people, and the judgment is God is going to send an ungodly nation, a pagan nation, political power against them. Now, Habakkuk's question is, God, yes, the people of Israel, people of Judah specifically now, they are unrighteous, they are wicked, they are evil, they are sinners. But how can you use a person, a people who are even wicked than them, they don't know God, they don't know you? In this case, Babylonians, how can you justify yourself in using the wicked nation against your own people? That is a question that he has. And what is the answer he gets? We will see that. So it says basically trying to justify God's action. It is not simply asking a question, but Habakkuk, the book of Habakkuk is trying to justify God is right, though he asked that question. God is right in using a wicked nation against his own people. Let's go to the book now. Only 3 chapters, and it's a very small book. Chapter 1, verse 1 tells us what is this book. And so there it identifies the prophet, who is the prophet, and what is he doing, and what has he done, and all that. So I'll read chapter 1, verse 1. The oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. It doesn't identify his father, any other details. It simply says the oracle that Habakkuk saw. But if some translations, it would say the burden. The English Standard Version has eased out to make it simple. Literally, an oracle there means a burden. So this is the burden that Habakkuk had. That is how it should be translated. What is the meaning of burden? This is not new, but this is the first time that Habakkuk uses the word, or any prophet uses the word burden for his ministry or for the preaching. The burden means oracle, which is the literal translation will be burden, means a sort of compulsion. That is, once the prophet receives the word from God, there is a compulsion on him until he preaches it to the people. It delivers it. Now we can see that in Jeremiah chapter 20 verse 9 and also Amos 3:8. When I did Amos 3:8, the book of Amos, I had mentioned that. So let's look at Amos chapter 3 verse 8. So Amos talks about the compulsion that he had. The lion has roared, who will not fear? The Lord God has spoken, who can but prophesy? Now this is the philosophy behind calling a prophetic oracle a burden. That this is a cause and effect. The lion, that is God, the Lord Yahweh, has spoken, has roared. So when lion has roared, the people who heard the roaring of the lion from Zion has to preach what they heard. So prophet has no excuse. Prophet has no other way. So that is why it is a burden. And Jeremiah puts it more beautifully. In Jeremiah chapter 20 verse 9. If I say, I will not mention him or speak anymore in his name. There is in my heart, as it were, a burning fire, shut up in my bones, and I am weary with holding it in, and I cannot. So Jeremiah says that the prophetic mission that he has received is like a burden. Means it is like fire that is shut up in his bones. Could you imagine fire, burning fire, flames that is locked into your bones instead of the marrow? And you have to shake it off somehow to get rid of by preaching it out. So that is why a prophetic message is a burden, something that you carry. Sometimes preachers go through that sort of a crisis. Crisis or means an experience when they have something that they have received from God, and they may be looking for a place to preach it, to let others know it, because they are so convinced it is from God. So let us look at the prophecy of Habakkuk from that angle. He calls it a burden, something that is on him. And until he let others know, unless he preaches it, he cannot actually, he cannot to relieve his burden. Cannot relieve his burden. Now, so we look at the first passage. That is Habakkuk's first question. Habakkuk's first question we see in first chapter 1, verses 2 to 11. Habakkuk had two questions. The first question is, why there is wickedness in the land, and why are you closing your eyes? We have seen that in detail in the book of Isaiah, in the other books as well. The people are wicked, there is sin, there is wickedness, there is evil rampant in the country. And Habakkuk's question is, God, are you simply looking on without doing anything? That is the question in chapter 1, verses 2 to 11. So, as I always do, I cannot read all the verses. Let me read chapter 1, 2 to 4. As I summarized it already, that is, why you are simply looking on. Chapter 1, verse 2 to 4. And particularly I'll read chapter 1, verse 3. That summarizes very well. Why do you make me see iniquity? Why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So he is actually critiquing his society, the society that he lives. And why God is not acting? Why is he tolerating this? The wickedness in the land is going on, and there seems to be no divine intervention. God seems to be doing nothing. But God has an answer for him. The next 6 verses, chapter 1, verse 5 to 11, God's response. God says, no, I have already planned. In my planning, I have a plan to deal with this wickedness in the land. You may not know. So God reveals to him what the plan is. God says, I am going to use a foreign nation to punish Judah. Now Israel is no more there. 100 years ago, the northern Israel went into, in the sense it was completely destroyed, conquered by the Assyrians. So Habakkuk lived almost 100 years after that. So he knows that God will act from the history of Samaria, northern Israel. But why God is not doing anything with Judah? So God says, look, I have already planned their punishment. In chapter 1, verse 6, which I read a minute ago, he told Habakkuk, look, I am preparing the Babylonians. Behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwelling not their own. That means the Babylonians are coming. I have ordered the Babylonians. The book of Isaiah, chapter 39, ends with that message. We did that last week. It says that the Babylonians, when Hezekiah showed them all his inventory of the wealth and his armory, Isaiah said, "You have done a foolish thing. This all will be carried by them. They will carry all this to Babylon." But now, after the days of Isaiah, maybe another 50 years or 60 years after the death of Isaiah, God assures Habakkuk that he is going to make Babylonians march against Judah and punish them for their sins. So what is the answer that Habakkuk got? The answer Habakkuk got is simple. He said, "No, I am not a God who tolerates wickedness and evil, but I am going to act. And that punishment is going to come by a Babylonian attack." And this is almost 10 years before, or 8 or 10 years before, Babylonians defeated Assyria in 612 by the fall of Nineveh. But still, it is very close, very close. Now, this raises another question. Habakkuk has one more difficult question for God. First question is, so this is why I said the book of Habakkuk is what we call a theodicy. A theodicy is trying to justify the acts of God, justifying God, or see God is just and why in such situations. So that is what the book of Habakkuk is trying to say. So Habakkuk's next question is, he got the answer. How can you use a wicked nation to punish your own people? Now that is the concern in chapter 1:12 to 2:1. It's a long passage. But Habakkuk takes time. He is the second crisis now. So he poses that question. Now, see, he describes the wickedness of the Babylonians. First of all, he tells God, as if God doesn't know now yet, that the wicked Babylonians are very wicked. They are very cruel. They are ungodly people. They are people who do all sort of things, bad things. They are not godly at all. They are a pagan nation. How can you use them against your own people whom you have called? It's a big question. So to get a feel of Habakkuk's feelings, I want to read chapter 1, verses 14 to 17. Please follow me in your Bibles. Habakkuk chapter 1, verses 14 to 17. You make mankind like fish of the sea, like crawling things that have no ruler. He brings all of them up with a hook. He drags them out with a net. He gathers them in his dragnet. So he rejoices and is glad. So therefore he sacrifices to his net and make offerings to his dragnet. For by then he lives in luxury and his food is rich. Is he then to keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? Okay, this is how Habakkuk puts it. How is Habakkuk putting it? God, listen, you have appointed Babylonians, and you know what you are doing? You are treating human beings like fish in the sea. And which the Babylonians with their strong dragnets, the nets, they can catch easily. They can catch and they can catch a school of fish by their dragnet. And what happens? So then they take they are very successful, they are very rich because they got a rich harvest of fish in their net. And you have treated human beings, the various nations. The Babylonians first defeated Assyrians by they were conquering smaller nations. Finally, the superpower of the world those days, they fell. Now, so God, you are allowing them to catch these nations, the various countries, the people, as if they are just fish. And not only that, the Babylonians have become our idolaters. So what are they doing? They give glory to their nets. So they do sacrifices to their nets because they think that they are weapons. It is basically an allusion to the worship or sacrifices offered to the weapons of war. Many cultures have that. The Ayuda Puja. That is what we call it here in India. That is worshipping those things, weapons, sword, spears, arrows, so that they give victory in your battles. So this is a nation, a debased nation, proud, rich by their aggressive behavior. They treat human beings and nations, other cultures, as if they are cheap fish that can be easily caught in a net. How can you use these people against your people? And now the second argument is the wickedness and the aggressive nature of the Babylonians, their ungodliness. The next issue is, see, your people are comparatively better. That's what Habakkuk says. So you look at these people, a warmongering people, they are battle hungry. They treat human beings, like fish. Now, in the book of Isaiah, we saw, and just to refresh your memory, the commanders or the military officials of these Assyrians, they were boasting. Even Sennacherib, the Assyrian emperor, king of Assyria, was boasting about his success. And in that he says, now I caught the nations like the eggs in a bird's nest. It was so easy. I could just gather all these nations so easily, like gathering eggs from a bird's nest. That is the Sennacherib's words of Sennacherib. Proud, arrogant Sennacherib. Here, Habakkuk says, look, these people are so arrogant. They treat people with mercilessly. Moreover, your people are comparatively better. See that 13th verse. In verse 13, he says, you who are purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong. How can you tolerate the wickedness of the Babylonians? And how can you ignore it to use them as instruments in your hand? Why do you idly look at the traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he? He is putting the very difficult questions to God. This is Babylonians are, and you are using this wicked nation to punish the man, which means Judah, the people of Judah, who are more righteous than them. Is that it? So where is your righteousness? Where is your justice in this case? So then he has no answer. Now how can God do this to us? This is a struggle with God. There is no prophet other than, there are prophets, but this is one of the prophets who struggled with God, demanding questions for issues that faces his world. The Babylonian uprising, the emergence, and denying human rights, defying boundaries, national boundaries, amassing wealth at the expense of others, enslavement, loot, booty, you can think of all the cruelties they did. Then he is fed up. So he said one thing, now I am going to the watchtower. Habakkuk says in verse 2:1, Habakkuk says, now with all these questions, I am going to meditate. So chapter 2 verse 1 is very interesting. It's a transition from question number 1 to the answer that God has for him. But that answer comes to him as the result of a meditation, a contemplation. Chapter 2 verse 1, I will take up my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. What I will answer concerning my complaint. So, Habakkuk takes a retreat. Why watchtower? I don't know. Nobody knows. Probably watchtower is a quiet, solitary place where he can be all alone, where he can just sit in the presence of God and listen to God. So he says, I will sit there to hear what he has to tell me about these questions that I posed to him. So this is basically a prayer life of the Habakkuk, the prophet Habakkuk. I would imagine Habakkuk is asking these questions in his prayer, the prayers of Habakkuk. It is not a face-to-face encounter. Then he says, I am going to the watchtower. I'll go up there, away from the noise of the people, down, and the busyness and all that. And I will go sit there and I will just listen to God. This verse is a very important verse in Christian spiritual practice. In Christian spiritual practice, we take this verse very seriously. That is, to hear God, you have to practice what is we call solitude. Sit in the presence of God so that God can speak to us. Now, then God did speak. See, the next few verses, that is, the remaining verses of chapter 2, starting with 2:2, chapter 2, verse 2 to 20, is God's answer. God gives him a simple answer. It is not the relative measure, relative merit of a nation that matters. Who is more wicked, who is less wicked. It is not that matters. But God is against all evil. Whether it is Babylonian evil, whether you can call it a Judean evil. God cannot tolerate sin. So what will he do? So God has a plan. His plan is to use Babylonians to punish Judah. Then in his own time, in his own way, God will punish Babylonians for their wickedness. Sounds familiar, isn't it? This is what Isaiah also preached. Isaiah also said, the Assyria is the rod of my anger. But then he also said that Assyria will be completely thrown away. Like a woodcutter throws away the axe after cutting the wood or something like that. He will discard it completely. So that is God's justice. So you get a clue about God's justice. God's justice is, there's only one point. God will not tolerate injustice and sin. God will punish it. But God will do it in his own way, in his own time. So God is not justifying Babylonians for their wickedness. God is cannot just tolerate the sin of Judah. Both has to be punished. God has his own way, and that is what we call the sovereignty of God. But the holiness of God means all evil has no nationality. All evil will be punished by a just God. So now let's look at a closer look at that passage. So God told him, do one thing. He said, okay, during that, while he was sitting on the watchtower high up there in the sky, away from the ground, God told him something. He said, do something. What is that? In 2:2, chapter 2, verse 2. Write the vision. The Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. Now, this is a familiar passage. I know many people have quoted this passage in whichever way they want to quote it. But the problem is, what exactly does it mean? It can have this can be taken in two ways, two different ways. One, make it plain, so that number one interpretation is, even a person who is running can read it. Make it so plain and clear, the vision that you have received now. And so that the person, even when a person runs fast, past this, whatever it is, he can read it. The second interpretation is that make it plain in such a way that a person who reads it will haste and run. Maybe means he will put it into action, or he will act on that oracle. That may be the other reason. One is the runner can read. Second, the reader will run. Running from what? He may be running from destruction that is coming. That is, they may repent and turn to God and escape from the destruction. That could be the reason why this has to be made very plain. Now, this is not new. In Isaiah chapter 8, Isaiah was also told to write down the vision or make a placard. Isaiah chapter 8:1. Take a large tablet and write on it in common characters, belonging to Maher Shalal Hasbas. So he said, make it plain so that people can read it. Use common characters so to make it easily readable. Anyway, so what is the prophecy to be read? In 2:6-8, 6-20, there's a long section. It's actually a taunt of the Babylonians. They're making fun of the Babylonians. Now we have seen that in the book of Isaiah also. The prophecy about the nations. That God tells him, you can see the destruction that is going to happen to the enemies of God, who are also the conquerors of his people. You can see that. And now you make a taunt song, which is a celebration of their destruction. In this section, there are 5 woes. W-O-E. 5 woes. In chapter 2, verse 6-8, first one. The second one is chapter 2, verses 9-11. Third one is 2:12-14. And 2:15-18. And the last one is chapter 2:19. A woe has 2 parts. One is, it declares the crime that people did. And secondly, then God says, what he is going to do with them, the punishment. So a woe has, like it says, two parts. One is, woe to this nation who are doing this, and for this I am going to punish them this way. So it's 5 oracles, a distinct crime of the Babylonians, and God says, see, I will not let Babylonians go scot-free. I will not. I will punish them for their sins. So that is the justice of God. Now, after that, Habakkuk sees the holiness of God. God is holy. Against the idols of the Babylonians, they worship war gods. They worship their weapons. They have idolized their success. But good God, the God of Judah, God of the Bible, He is holy. In the midst of all this, verse 20, chapter 2, 20. But the Lord is in His holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before Him. See that you have to read that whole section. Okay, in a Bible study like this, I cannot elaborate everything. So he says the Lord is still in control. In spite of all that He does, He is still a holy God. He will not compromise His holiness. In His actions, He is holy. So that is why I said Habakkuk's main concern is to justify. Though there may be questions, how can God do that? Number one question, how can God tolerate injustice? God said, I am not going to tolerate injustice. I have a plan, and I am going to punish them with the Babylonians. Now the second question, how can you use Babylonians who are even more wicked than your people to punish them? The idolaters, the pagans, who doesn't know you? God said, no, I have a plan to punish Babylonians for their excesses. And then He says, this is the plan. Through the 5 condemnations, woes, He makes it very, very plain. Then finally, He concludes His prophetic oracle or a burden with praise of God, doxology, praising God for His holiness, which means He's breaking out into worship, which means Habakkuk is now settled to accept God's plan, that God is still holy, though He may allow unholy people to attack or punish His people. Because the weapon doesn't matter. The weapons that He uses, that doesn't matter. What matters is His holiness. He is concerned with His holiness. Even the weapon will be thrown away, but He will establish His justice in this world because God is holy. So chapter 2 verse 20 is a key verse then. Then comes the last part in the 19 verses. Habakkuk, probably he is convinced now, pretty well convinced, that days of calamity are going to come. Because God has ordered this punishment will happen very soon. And within 40 years, less than 40 years, it did happen. 620, 596. 620 to 596 is about 30 years. Within 30-40 years, Babylonians did attack Judah. 2 times within a gap of 10 years. God's words were fulfilled. Did Habakkuk live through the crisis, the catastrophe of foreign invasion, destruction, all that? Probably he did. Like Prophet Jeremiah also lived through that. He was there on the scene. And Habakkuk was also there. But Habakkuk prepares himself for that day because he is convinced that day is coming. God has ordained it. So this song is a song that Habakkuk sings expressing his trust in the Holy God. Expressing his trust in Holy God. It stands out from the rest of the book. Very, very different also in its tone and its theme as well. And it says, there's a title, what is this prayer all about? And there's a conclusion. Verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth. Frankly speaking, we don't know what Shigionoth is. That word comes in the singular in other two passages in the Psalms, but we still don't know what that means. Anyway, it's a tune, maybe a scale or a tune in which these songs should be sung. Let's not bother ourselves about that. And verses 3, 1 to 16, it's a prayer to God. It's a prayer has to do with the awesomeness of God. How awesome is God? It's praying, it's praising God who will not tolerate wickedness. So the two aspects of that. And then in verse 16 he says, my God, what you are going to do, I am awestruck. I am terrified by what you are going to do to the Babylonians. So see, the prophet is saying this even before Babylonians have attacked them. In 3:16, I should read 16 to you, verse 16. I hear, yes Lord, I heard your plan to punish Babylonians whom you used to punish your people, sinful people. But when I heard your plan, the 5 woes that God has already uttered in the previous chapter, when I heard this, my body trembles, my lips quiver at the sound, rottenness enters into my bones, my legs tremble beneath me, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble. Have you ever heard somebody saying that? That I will wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. See, this is amazing. He says, now I know you have a plan against the Babylonians. And what you have planned for them. So read carefully the 5 woes that I mentioned earlier. When you go through that, he says, my lips quiver, my legs shake, I tremble. Because what we are going to do for those who invade us, that means Babylonians, because I know you have a plan against our own enemies. And I am waiting for that day. Which day? That day when you will fulfill your plans against the Babylonians. And I am getting myself ready for the days of trouble. But that day, before that day, comes another day. That is, Babylonians will attack Judah, humble them, God will punish them for their sins. So I am mentally ready. I accept your plan, God. I see, but it's not a very pleasant thing. It's terrifying what you are going to do. But I am getting ready for my own, to face that day of punishment. That is that song. Then he says, how will he do that? He says, let's look at that thing. That is the last 2 verses. And last 3 verses. I think I should read all that. Habakkuk chapter 3, 17, 18, 19. though the fig tree should not blossom. When the Babylonians attack us, the fig tree may not blossom because they may probably cut it down. Nor fruit be on the vines. The produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food. That means when the Babylonians devastate the land, there will be famine, starvation, failure of agriculture. Not only that, the livestock as well. The flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. So this calamity means there will be lack, hunger, but in the still I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. What a trust is this. He says, now where we started, you remember where we started? He was asking questions to a righteous God. Now he has come to a point where he accepts that. And he says, all that I have to do is not to pray to God to avert this, but get ready, humble myself, to submit myself to God's plan, to go through it, because this is not go forever. God will punish the Babylonians for their sins too. And he will restore his people. That is the prophecy of that's another important thing as well. But I will rejoice. I will trust in the Lord. I will prepare myself for this calamity. And in verses 18 and 19, he says the reason why he will have that endurance to face the calamity that God had planned for him. That he says the secret is that my salvation is God and my strength comes from God. Verse 18 and 19. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will take joy in the Lord of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on high places. Habakkuk has in his mind the animals that escape devastation far down by running to the hills, the steep rock faces, because they have the strength that God has given them. So they will be safe up there when the ground far below is being devastated, because the strength to live above the problems comes from God. The deliverance in times of trouble and bondage comes from God. That's the fine note by which Habakkuk closes his prophecy. Now, what can we gather from the study today? A few things. Number one, these are personal things that I will share with you. One, there is no question that we should not ask God. It's better to address all our questions to God than holding it within ourselves or asking wrong persons. Why? Because God has all answers to all questions. Number two, when we are puzzled, confused, when we best take time to be alone with God, practice solitude. You, I, and my God alone. That is where we receive, we hear God. Third, instead of praying for averting disaster, pray for strength to face it. The strength that comes from God alone. Because God will preserve us during times of catastrophe, so that when God restores his people, we may be part of it. Until then, rest in the arms of God. Trust, hide ourselves in under his wings. That's what God has offered us. Praise be to God.